Hello, I'm Áine Hensey, and the title of my talk today is The Rebel Priests of Mullagh, the roles of Father Pat Gaynor and Father Michael McKenna in the War of Independence. In the early days of the decade of commemorations, I read a book by my former colleague in Maynooth University, Brian Heffernan, entitled Freedom and the Fifth Commandment, Catholic Priests and Political Violence in Ireland between 1920 and 1921. It's a highly recommended read for those of you interested in the role of the Catholic clergy, both official and unofficial, institutional and individual, during the years of the War of Independence. Heffernan demonstrates the considerable diversity of opinion, attitude and involvement that existed among Catholic priests with regard to the political and military developments of the time. What particularly took my attention, though, were his references to events in the Curettes House in Mullagh, the home during these 2 years of two extraordinary priests of the Killaloe diocese. They were Father Pat Gaynor, a native of Tyrone near Nenagh in Tipperary, and Father Michael McKenna, who was born in Tulla. Heffernan gives us a number of intriguing snapshots that point to an unusually revolutionary environment within the curacy of the parish. Most of Heffernan's detail is taken from the memoir of Father Gaynor, held in the National Library of Ireland and published in 2003 as part of Memoirs of a Tipperary Family, the Gaynors of Tyrone, 1887 to 2000. And my thanks to Frank Whelan for drawing my attention to this book and also for giving me a loan of his own copy. So this paper is the result of my intrigue about the lives of these two priests who had very significant, albeit very different influences on the course of local and national history during these years. And I'll be paying particular attention to the period that they spent together in Mullagh, in the parish of Kilmurry-Ibricken from 1920 to 1921. Firstly, to fill in some background on Fathers Gaynor and McKenna, whose lives followed similar paths through their youths and early adulthood. Pat Gaynor was born in Tyrone near Nenagh in 1887. And following his mother's early death, he was reared by his paternal grandmother in nearby Rapla. He attended the CBS in Nenagh until being offered special terms to come to St. Flannan's College in Ennis. It was during his time in Flannan's that his interest in the Irish language was first nurtured, originally by Seamus Clandillan, who taught in the school and who later became the first head of 2RN, the forerunner of Radio Éireann. On enrolment in Maynooth in 1905, Gaynor and many of his fellow clerical students soon involved themselves in the Columban League, which was the college's Cunra na Gaeilge, as well as taking an avid interest in the emerging policies of Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin movement. Gaynor wrote that, quote, "The idea of repudiating British authority by withdrawal from Westminster and of setting up an Irish Parliament in Dublin fascinated our minds as a worthwhile experiment. The only question was whether the Irish people could be induced to adopt the plan and whether they had a sense of discipline to make it a success." Despite incurring the displeasure of both the college authorities and his own Bishop Michael Fogarty during his time in Maynooth, Gaynor was ordained in 1911 and his first posting was to the mission in Glasgow. He spent 3 years there and appears to have enjoyed himself immensely, the highlight of each week being the trip to Celtic Park to see Glasgow Celtic and particularly star striker Jimmy Quinn in action. He also played golf and cards and made regular trips to London to attend as many plays as possible, taking in matinees and evening performances each day for a week. And he would retain his interest in theatre for the rest of his life. On his return to the Killaloe diocese in 1914, he was appointed diocesan inspector, a position that, in his own words, allowed him great freedom to pursue his interest in the political developments of the day. While he played no active part in the 1916 Rising and was not, in general, a supporter of armed violence, he had huge admiration for the leaders, especially Pearse and Connolly. Throughout all this time, he maintained his commitment to the principles of Griffith's Sinn Féin policy, and his first major chance to propagate these ideas came with the East Clare by-election of 1917. Following the successful election of Eamon de Valera, Father Pat gave what he himself described as a hot lecture in the town hall in Ennis, explaining in detail how a Sinn Féin parliament in Dublin would function through the county councils and district councils, through Sinn Féin arbitration courts and through the various organised groups in the country. The lecture was subsequently published in pamphlet form under the title The Faith and Morals of Sinn Féin, and it served as an eloquent manifesto for a new form of Irish government. The contents of this remarkable document could fill an entire paper here in itself, and really is worth reading in full. There are copies in Trinity College and in the National Library, and it's also available to read online on the TCD Library website. Basically, while not quite communist in nature, there are definite shades of red in Father Pat's vision for a republic where wealth and resources would be shared equally between all citizens, and where British rule would be rendered redundant by the disciplined and far-sighted administrative intelligence of an alternative Sinn Féin government, working in tandem with the major cooperative political and cultural organisations in the country. The upshot of his role in the election of De Valera and the publication of his pamphlet was that Gaynor was one of 2 priests elected to the national executive of Sinn Féin at its Ardèche in October 1917, where he received almost 600 votes. He was in exalted company, alongside De Valera, Griffith, Owen MacNeill, Jenny Wise-Power, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Michael Collins and Cathal Brua. The other priest on the Ard Comhairle was Michael O'Flanagan of Elphin, County Roscommon, who was elected vice president and whose name in general has been remembered much more widely. As a member of the National Executive and the Standing Committee, Gaynor had the right to be present at any meeting of the local executive or Comhairle Council in North Tipperary, in East or in West Clare. Because I want to focus on his time as curate in Mullagh, there's not really time here today to delve fully into all aspects of his work in the administration of the Sinn Féin institutions during the years of the First Dáil and the War of Independence. But I should mention an article by Carmel Clancy, published in the journal The Other Clare in 2007. Entitled The Experiences of a Sinn Féin Priest, Father Pat Gaynor and Self-Government in Clare, 1919 to 1921. This article focuses on the extensive work undertaken by Gaynor as chairman of the Mental Hospital Committee, among other bodies. And I think it's important to bear in mind that he himself claimed that his, quote, real interests and activities were outside the parish of Mullagh and were devoted to country affairs and realms of local administration. While he claims to have had full sympathy with the activities of the volunteers when they were sanctioned, at least in a general way, by Dáil Éireann, his real interest always lay in civil administration. He firmly believed that, quote, maintenance of the whole fabric of local government, collecting rates and holding them safe to meet the cost of public institutions and home help and medical services, etc., was much more important than firing shots at and mostly failing to hit the British Army of Occupation. Gaynor spent the early days of the First Dáil mostly in North Tipperary, where he was elected chairman of the North Tipperary Executive of Sinn Féin, just before the contentious local elections of December 1919. His role in the events surrounding this election may have led Bishop Fogarty to initiate his transfer, although the priest himself claimed to have enjoyed a good relationship with his bishop during this period. In early 1920, he arrived in the parish of Kilmurry-Ibricken as replacement for Father John Considine and took up residence in the Curettes House in Mullagh. On his arrival, he was greeted by a friend of long standing, Father Michael McKenna, who had been Gaynor's fellow student in St Flannan's and in Maynooth, and who had also worked in Glasgow immediately after his ordination. Michael McKenna was the son of Dennis McKenna and Anne Littleton of Main Street, Tulla, and like Father Pat, he was born in 1887. His father Dennis was one of the founders of the Tulla Hurling Club, and he played in the All-Ireland final of 1889 when the Clare representatives were defeated by Kickham's of Dublin. He and his family enthusiastically supported the new Sinn Féin ideals, and he was described by the Nina Guardian at the time of his death in 1938 as, quote, one of the best known figures in every movement for Irish independence during recent years. Recently, while he lay bedridden without hope of recovery, he was visited by An Taoiseach. The McKenna House was a recognised headquarters for the new sphere of nationalist activity, and Dennis was the recipient of a number of beatings at the hands of the Black and Tans. Father Michael's mother and his 4 sisters, Mary Ann, later the renowned Sister Lelia, Bridget, Anna and Nora, were all active in the successful election of De Valera in 1917. so the family must have known Father Pat Gaynor well. Father McKenna was recalled from Glasgow in 1913 and served as curate in Clare for 2 years, until he enlisted as a chaplain in the British Army, where he served in France until 1919. Upon his return to Clare, he was appointed curate in Mullagh. Interestingly, while McKenna was serving in France, his family, and especially his 4 sisters, were very active in the successful election of De Valera in the 1917 by-election. But while the contents of his memoir allow us to trace the evolution of Gaynor's political views in the years before his arrival in Mullagh, unfortunately we are unable to do the same for McKenna. However, Gaynor makes regular reference to him during their time together in Maynooth and in Glasgow, and these snapshots create a picture of a young man who was full of fun and possessed of, quote, reckless courage. This second attribute, as well as his experiences in the trenches of France, led to McKenna's appointment as commandant of the local battalion of the Volunteers in Mullagh, and he was, according to Gaynor, responsible for control of the whole Sinn Féin movement in the parish. McKenna's fearless nature is revealed in an incident that happened shortly before Gaynor came to Mullagh, when a local quilty man, Michael Casey, organised a cattle drive against Sinn Féin orders. McKenna faced the mob alone and was hit in the face by a stone. But undaunted, he summoned the volunteer battalion to march into Quilty the next morning and, quote, put the fear of death into Michael Casey. On another occasion, when cycling home from saying Mass in a private house, he was stopped by a party of soldiers in black and tans from Ennistimon, led by an officer called Black. Having been told to get down from his bicycle and to leave it in the road, McKenna was then ordered to climb a fence into the roadside field. When he refused to comply with the last of these orders, Black threatened to shoot him if he did not obey before the count of 10. McKenna apparently told him that he could stop counting at 5, at which time the British officer backed down. Gaynor recounts this story in his memoir to illustrate the stubborn and fearless nature of his colleague, who he claims did not realise that the British would most likely have shot him as soon as he entered the field, claiming that he had fled to escape from the patrol. At one point, Gaynor describes McKenna as having 1 million friends, and his popularity certainly cost him one day when he left the train at Kilmurray to discover that the station was occupied by a party of soldiers. When a friend on the train spotted him on the platform and greeted him enthusiastically by name, the commanding soldier confronted the priest and made him stand against the wall, flanked by 2 soldiers with fixed bayonets. When the train had left, McKenna was marched away and ordered to take a shovel and help with filling in a huge trench which had been dug in the road earlier by Joe Daly and a group of volunteers. Needless to remark, McKenna refused, but had to stand in torrential rain for 2 hours until the soldiers had completed the job and he was released. What comes across very clearly throughout Gaynor's account of his time in Mullagh is the extent to which the Sinn Féin institutions functioned as the de facto local government in the area, controlling matters of justice, policing and administration. Or, as Gaynor himself wrote, the writ of the Irish government ran merrily in our jurisdiction. And there's little doubt that for the year and a half that they spent together there, this part of West Clare was controlled by these 2 extraordinary priests. One a firm advocate of an abstentionist and obstructionist, but wholly political movement, and the other a daredevil with a resolute focus on the pursuit of a campaign of guerrilla warfare. 2 sides of one coin that had the same objective of ultimately banishing British rule from Ireland. As early as August 1919, the Irish Independent was reporting that the parish priest of Kilmurray-Ibricken, Father Glynn, had announced the formation of a Vigilance Committee for the safeguarding of parishioners in the absence of the, quote, withdrawn police force. This move was evidently a precursor to the establishment of the Republican Police. Shortly after his arrival in Mullagh, Gaynor assumed the role of Brigade Chief of Police when the incumbent, Willie Shannon, along with Paddy O'Dea of Scropple, was tortured and killed by the Black and Tans in Ennis. One of the principal roles of this body appears to have been the enforcement of judgments handed down by the Sinn Féin district courts, and Gaynor himself played an active role in a number of such incidents. Among the more notorious of these was a case involving an elderly couple, the Obriens of Mullagh, and their nephew Patrick Connors from Clare. The upshot of this particular trial, retrial and eventual court-martial by Father McKenna and his battalion staff was that Gaynor decided to place Connors in solitary confinement on the uninhabited Mullagh Island, just off the coast at Seafield in Quilty. Connors was kept there for a month, with food being ferried out to him at intervals. And Gaynor appears to have been so pleased with the success of this punishment that he says he, quote, had in view to let other disturbers in West Clare see that there was an admirable Sinn Féin prison on Mullagh Island. However, this did not conclude the Connors saga, as the young man had procured an order from the aforementioned Willie Shannon, allowing him to bring some of the Curettes volunteers into Mullagh to evict his uncle Peter O'Brien from his house. Disappointed that the local volunteers did not stand up for the elderly O'Briens, Gaynor summoned a convention of all the authorities under the Irish Republic in West Clare and duly secured a unanimous verdict in favour of the O'Briens. But when he approached Connors in the house and asked him to leave, Connors laughed in his face and said, "It'll take more than a bloody Tipperary man to put me out." Gaynor calmly told Connors that he had half an hour to decide whether he wanted to leave the house alive or be carried out dead. Despite repeatedly claiming to be a convinced believer in the policy of non-violence, the curate returned with the rifle-bearing Joe Daly and another 2 armed volunteers. He convinced the men that they could open fire on Connors, if necessary, without any qualm of conscience. As they approached the house, Connors was seen running out the back door and heading straight for Clare. This story and others like it raise interesting questions about how deeply Gaynor really believed in the efficacy of the exclusively non-violent approach to the building of a republic in Ireland, as mentioned earlier. Certainly, he argues throughout his memoir that the most potent weapons in forcing the British hand to seek a truce and negotiations with Sinn Féin were the policy of abstentionism from Westminster, the convening of the First Dáil in Dublin, and the establishment of a local administrative structure to effectively remove power from the British institutions. However, a closer examination of his story reveals that he consistently justified the acts of sabotage and violence that went hand in hand with this passive resistance. He recalled that in 1916 he met the O'Reilly, and while making a contribution of £5 to the volunteers, he also asked the volunteer leader for a gun. O'Reilly duly gave him a .22 bore, a mere toy according to Gaynor, which he still had in his possession while writing his memoir in the 1940s. And indeed, he lent it to one of the volunteers who had no weapon during the earlier mentioned confrontation with Patrick Connors in Mullagh. So even though Gaynor claimed that he never meddled in the affairs of the volunteers and never attended meetings of the Battalion Council, there was clearly a certain amount of blurring between the activities of the IRA and his declared roles of Sinn Féin leader, acting chief of police and priest. For example, the court-martial of Patrick Connors took place in the Curettes House, and even though Gaynor did not attend the hearing, it was his advice that was sought and acted upon with regard to imposing a sentence on the prisoner. I believe that Gaynor's apparent ambiguity about the use of violence may rather be interpreted as an uncertainty about its efficacy. On the one hand, he wrote, quote, "I did not approve of open war myself, though I never said a word against the policy. But then I was not a volunteer and was not free, as a priest, to urge young men into battle when I would not have shared their risks." On the other hand, in reaction to the shooting of 3 armed policemen in Kilmehel in April 1920, he defended the attack as justified, saying, "Since the Irish government, Dáil Éireann, had authorised the volunteers to attack the British forces at every opportunity in our war of self-defence, it seems to me, though I thought our appeal to the gun a tactical mistake, that the volunteers acted within their rights as soldiers of the Irish Army." The operation of the Sinn Féin courts was a major component of the new Dáil's strategy to wrest control of local administration from the British authorities. And while Father Charlie Culligan of Kilmehel was president of the West Clare District Court, both Mullagh curates were also heavily involved in its activities. The court was convened in a different location each time and often held in an isolated house or barn where the approach of soldiers or other intruders would be easily seen. Following a military raid on a sitting in a house in Craganock, Gaynor also developed a strategy of only revealing the location of the court when people arrived at the centre to which they had been summoned. Thus, when a number of men had been prosecuted for having stolen a half barrel of porter from the Atlantic Hotel in Spanish Point, one of them passed information to the British authorities about the impending court hearing, but could not pinpoint the location. The Black and Tans searched every house in and near Mullagh, but to no avail. While the courts were clearly successful in helping to maintain law and order, in a situation where a sizable number of the local population refused to recognise the British courts and police service, Gaynor had reservations about its operation. When a dispute between two families was settled by the court, he believed that the case set up a precedent by which people thought that their long-standing wrongs and grievances could be righted. Claims and disputes about land and property, which dated back 40 years or more, were brought to light, and in some instances, according to Gaynor, flagrantly unjust verdicts were passed down by members of the court. At one point, in the absence of any higher court of appeal, he had the court itself dismissed for, quote, incompetence, if not worse. And in the aftermath of the Connors case, he began to wonder whether any man in the brigade could be trusted to forget family ties and family feuds and personal prejudices, and to uphold Sinn Féin law and justice without fear or favour. He wrote, quote, "This is how we waged war on the British forces in West Clare. All our efforts were spent on trying to cope with self-seekers and troublemakers." However, Brian Heffernan offers an alternative view of Gaynor's actions, claiming that his dismissal of the court and his decision to try the case by a convention composed of IRA officers and members of the Sinn Féin executive shows how little the protagonists of the Republican administration in this part of the country respected judicial independence, while also demonstrating how large the priest could loom over proceedings as a figure of local authority. Gaynor claimed that there were just 2 military operations in the parish during his time there. The first of these followed the shooting of Major Lindrum, a local RM who was in the habit of driving around alone, armed with a revolver. When he was held up at a level crossing near Doonbeg, he drew his revolver and was shot by a young volunteer. The car was driven to the beach and Lindrum was buried in the sand to await the upcoming tide, where his body was later recovered. Fearful of reprisals, Father McKenna mobilised his battalion with whatever arms they could muster, and the volunteers kept watch in the village all night. However, there was no attack. In Curettes, an elderly man believed to have spread untrue rumours about a member of the North Clare flying column was taken out of his house and made to kneel down and say an act of contrition in the belief that he was about to be shot. He was then kicked and released with a warning to keep quiet in the future. Despite the central role of both priests in the religious, political and military activities of the parish, there was still plenty of time for sport. And this is how Gaynor describes life in the Curettes House. Gaiety was the order of the day and of the night during the mad year and a half which I spent with Father McKenna in Mullagh. Sometimes I used to call a halt, adverting that the Tans might raid the house and find a festive party in the small hours. And worse still, might capture a frequent guest, Ignatius O'Neill, whom they would have burnt to death after the Renine ambush. I love this idea of these men having time for fun amid all the danger and hardships that they endured during the War of Independence. I would always have had a view of people like Ignatius O'Neill and other IRA leaders as being somewhat austere. So it's interesting to read Gaynor's description of him and others as being full of mischief. O'Neill had earlier been cared for in the house in Mullagh for 2 months following his wounding at the incident at Crow's Bridge in February 1920, which resulted in the shooting dead of Martin Devitt. Among others who enjoyed the attractions of the Curettes House were Father Paddy Vaughan and Ignatius O'Neill's sister Irene, a, quote, charming little lady home from the West Indies. Mrs. Moran, Canon Mead's sister, also home from America on holidays, was a welcome guest. And Gaynor says, friends of the O'Neill family from Milltown and Father McKenna's friends from here and there also added to our gaiety in that wild year when we ought to have been shaking in our shoes at the Black and Tan menace. And you'd be glad to hear that hosts and guests were all very temperate. We might take a glass of wine, wrote Gaynor, but the whiskey decanter was seldom, if ever, on the table. The story of Father McKenna's motorcycle illustrates the madcap nature of life in the company of these men. A Father Horrigan of Glasgow offered his friend a gift of the motorbike, and McKenna happily accepted, despite the fact that it was forbidden during these times for anyone to use a motor vehicle in Ireland without a special permit. The motorcycle was collected in Dublin and put on the train for Ennis at King's Bridge. But McKenna, impatient to try out his new toy, intercepted the train at Naas and began the long drive home, despite holding neither permit nor driving licence. He was stopped once at Nenagh but was waved on. Then he crossed the bridge at Killaloe and nothing would do him but to swing by Tulla to pay a visit to his mother. Apparently the McKenna house was almost opposite the police barracks there and was carefully watched as a result of the family's ongoing involvement in Republican activity. McKenna told the policeman that the necessary papers were at home in another coat and he was allowed to leave for Mullagh. He arrived home in great glee, and as Gaynor wrote, the adventure, which would have given anyone else grey hairs, was entirely to his heart's desire. But of course the police were now aware of the motorcycle's presence in Mullagh. When the first raid happened, Ignatius O'Neill saw the police in time and escaped on the motorcycle. They were back a few days later, and this time McKenna and O'Neill were still in bed. The housekeeper, Nan Harrison, described as a quick-witted young lady, told the sergeant that McKenna was out saying a private mass and they were left in peace again. But while Gaynor was growing increasingly concerned for the safety of their guest, neither McKenna nor O'Neill himself saw any reason for him to, quote, renounce the fun and folly of Mullagh for mere considerations of risk. Fortunately, raid number 3 happened on the day of the Lahinch regatta. O'Neill and Father Paddy Vaughan were sleeping in the house and would normally have still been in bed that morning, but O'Neill, quote, who ought to have been sheltering in a dugout in Mount Callan, afraid to show his face, must have his fun. And the pair had jumped out of bed and caught the train to Lahinch, even risking travelling through Milltown-Malbay. While O'Neill had escaped, the precious motorcycle was captured and confiscated. The police did return the machine to Father McKenna, but some vital part was removed that rendered it useless. This final raid persuaded Gaynor that O'Neill was no longer safe in the Curettes House, and he asked him to leave. Just a few nights later, soldiers and Black and Tans arrived and made a thorough search. When the Tans had left, Gaynor found McKenna in the sitting room, involved in an argument with a Scottish officer over the morality of shooting policemen. A few weeks later, another raiding party found Ignatius O'Neill's father in the house. He was staying in Mullagh following the burning of his own house as reprisal for the Rineen ambush. Despite his wild nature, Gaynor described McKenna as, quote, an excellent priest, always kind and attentive to the people, while also having great quickness of wit and ingenuity in deriving amusement and mild practical jokes. He was the life and soul of festive parties and was loved by everyone for his gaiety and generosity of heart. But when he saw the chance for fun or adventure, he simply would not consider risks, or if he did, they simply added to the delight of his escapades. I used to feel in Sinn Féin times that he and his friend Ignatius O'Neill were reincarnations of the wildest wild geese of Ireland and were born to lead forlorn hopes in some fantastic war. In the case of Ignatius O'Neill, it is intriguing that the home of both the commandant of the local volunteers and a member of the Sinn Féin National Executive should be regarded as a safe house for one of the area's most wanted men. But perhaps it is indicative of the respect or fear in which the clergy were held, that they were granted a certain degree of immunity. Following a sitting of the Sinn Féin court mentioned earlier in a disused house in the middle of a field in Craganock, which was raided by the Black and Tans, Gaynor was cycling along the road to attend to a number of wounded men when the soldiers raised their rifles towards him. According to Father Charlie Culligan, only the information that he was a priest saved the Mullagh curate from being shot on the road. Gaynor deemed that even the seemingly irascible Thomas Connors dared not use his revolver against a priest. And when both curates were arrested in a further escalation of the same case, their parish priest, Father Glynn, hired a motor car and drove to Ennistimon Barracks, where he, quote, used his great eloquence, threatening papal protest and international complications if Gaynor were not released. When he was eventually let go, the senior inspector said, I am at a loss to know what to do with you. You may go for the present, but you'd better be there if we want you. "I am a priest," replied Gaynor. "I will not go on the run from you or anyone." While their parish priest, Father Glynn, was not involved with Sinn Féin, Gaynor described him as, quote, "very kind to us and let us go our own way without a word of censure. He was in sympathy with Sinn Féin, though he took no part in the movement." Both priests were inevitably eventually summoned to appear for trial before a British court-martial in Limerick. Of course, they ignored the summons, but took the precaution of packing up their possessions and leaving them in local houses for safekeeping. On the 12th of May 1921, as he was cycling home from Ennis, Gaynor was arrested in Kilmaley and taken to Limerick jail. He was greeted by the governor, who said, "I've been expecting you for a long time." The following morning, McKenna was detained in the house in Mullagh, and there's a story that Ignatius O'Neill and his comrades were planning to ambush the lorries on their return from the village, but having spotted the priest in one of the vehicles, the volunteers were obliged to let them pass safely. On his arrival in Limerick, McKenna strode up to his fellow curate, shook his hand and said, "By God, Pat, you and I have done nearly everything possible together in this world except to get married." Having refused to recognise the authority of the British court, both men were sentenced to 6 months in jail for possession of treasonable documents. Just as they had done in Mullagh, they made the most of life in prison. With their fellow prisoners, they played football with a rag ball, as well as rounders, pitch and toss, and cribbage, and had plenty of visitors. While McKenna harboured dreams of escape when he heard of the wild celebrations in the aftermath of the truce, they appeared to have been quite comfortable while serving out their sentences. And Gaynor even wrote that he was happy in jail and, quote, "glad of the rest and the peace." They were released in October and were given a month's holiday before their return to parish duty. The two men went to London and spent the money that had been donated to them by the people of Mullagh on luncheons, dinners, theatres and hotel bills. They were then invited to dinner with Bishop Fogarty in Westbourne, where he complimented them on the honour that they had done to the diocese. Proof that the British bishop's admiration was sincere was the fact that both priests were promoted to curacies that were considerably larger than they would have expected at their age. Gaynor went to Birr and McKenna to Roscrea. As far as I can ascertain, neither priest was involved in the Civil War. Gaynor wrote with a heavy heart, "I never dreamt that the glorious Sinn Féin bid for freedom would end in the miserable fiasco of the Civil War." He would eventually return to West Clare, first as parish priest of Áine Kilnamona and then of Kilmehel, where he died suddenly in December 1949 while still working on his remarkable memoir. Father McKenna moved from Roscrea to Puckane in 1925 and was then curate in Milltown Malbay from 1934 to 39, and he died as parish priest of Cross in 1960. By all accounts, he never lost his sense of humour and fun. Gaynor tells a story of him in the late 1940s dressing up as a nun and visiting the convent in Killaloe, where he tried to persuade one of the community to travel with him on a visit to Canon Mullagh. Just a brief afterword in relation to this talk. Most of what I have spoken about today has been taken from the memoir of one man. As I have said, it is a remarkable account of the exploits of some extraordinary people during a pivotal period in our history. But I'm also aware that there are probably different versions of these stories with differing emphases and outlooks alongside them that are equally valid. Father Pat Gaynor was a singular man with strong opinions that many would not always agree with. But I do think that he has been sadly ignored by most historians of the period. And having issued those few words of caution, I would still highly recommend this memoir as a hugely entertaining and informative read. And I would also like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the late Mike Torpey of the Tulla History Society, who gave me so much help during my research into the life of Father Michael McKenna. Go to Mullagh.